The room was full of laughter. It was one of those evenings when the house looked beautiful, warm lights glowing from every corner, soft music playing in the background, and the smell of freshly cooked food filling the air. People were sitting around the dining table, talking, laughing, enjoying themselves. Wine glasses clinked together. Someone told a joke and everyone burst into laughter. From the outside, it looked like a perfect family gathering. But if someone had looked closely at my face, they would have seen something very different. Because I was sitting quietly at the end of the table, forcing a small smile, pretending that everything was fine. But inside my chest, something didn't feel right. I had lived in this house for more than 40 years. Every wall had a memory. Every corner had a story. But that evening, something felt strange, almost like I didn't belong there anymore. My name is Margaret. I'm 68 years old, and until that night, I believed my family respected me. Maybe not the way they used to, but at least enough to treat me with kindness. Or at least, that's what I thought. That evening, my son Daniel and his wife Vanessa had invited several friends over for dinner. They had recently moved into my house after Daniel convinced me it would be better for everyone. He said the house was too big for me. He said I shouldn't live alone. He said we would be happier living together as a family. And like a foolish mother who still believed in her son's love, I agreed. At first, everything seemed normal. Vanessa acted polite. Daniel seemed caring, but slowly, things began to change. Small things at first. Vanessa rearranged the furniture without asking me. Then she replaced the pictures on the wall. Pictures of my late husband, my memories, my past. She said they made the house look old. Then she started calling the house our place. Not once did she say it was mine, but I tried not to think about it too much. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, families sometimes need time to adjust. That night, the dining table was full. Vanessa loved hosting parties. She loved attention, and she especially loved impressing people. As I sat quietly, I watched her move around the room, laughing loudly, telling stories, acting like she owned everything. At one point, I got up to go to the kitchen. I wanted to bring out another plate of food. But when I walked toward the kitchen door, I heard something that made me stop. Vanessa's voice. She was whispering to Daniel. I didn't mean to listen, but the kitchen door was slightly open, and their voices carried clearly. Vanessa leaned closer to him and laughed softly. "She's embarrassing," she whispered. My heart skipped a beat. For a moment, I thought maybe I misunderstood. But then she continued, "I swear, once we take over the house, I won't let her sit at the table with our guests again." My fingers tightened around the plate I was holding. Take over the house? For a moment, I felt like the ground had disappeared under my feet. This house, the house she was talking about, was the same house I had worked my entire life to keep. After my husband died, Daniel was only 8 years old. 8. I worked 2 jobs just to pay the mortgage. Some nights I slept only 3 hours. Some mornings I woke up before sunrise just to prepare Daniel for school. I missed birthdays. I missed holidays. But I never missed a mortgage payment because I promised myself something. Yung suot daw mergaki hastar. My son would always have a home. And now, standing there behind that door, I realized something that hurt more than anything. My son didn't say a single word to defend me. Not one. He just sat there quietly while his wife laughed about taking my home. I felt a tight pain in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Just sadness. The kind of sadness that slowly breaks your heart. I placed the plate on the counter and took a deep breath. Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe it was just a joke. That's what I kept telling myself. But 10 minutes later, everything changed. Everyone had gathered around the table again. Dinner was almost finished. People were talking loudly, enjoying themselves. And then Vanessa suddenly stood up. She picked up her wine glass and tapped it gently with a spoon. Clink, clink, clink. The sound made everyone turn toward her. "Attention, everyone," she said with a bright smile. The room became quiet. I looked up from my plate, confused. Vanessa loved giving little speeches at her parties. Usually they were harmless, just silly jokes, or thank you messages. But something about the way she was smiling made my stomach tighten. She looked around the table dramatically before speaking again. "I just want to thank someone tonight," she said. People leaned forward, curious, and then she turned her head and looked directly at me. "Margaret." A few guests politely clapped. I forced a small smile, but Vanessa's next words felt like a knife. "I want to thank Margaret," she said slowly, "for reminding us what not to become when we grow old." For a moment, no one laughed. People looked confused. But then Vanessa chuckled, and a few guests gave nervous laughs. My face grew hot. My hands felt cold. Vanessa continued speaking. "She still thinks this house belongs to her," she said jokingly. "But honestly, she's just living in the past." A couple of people laughed louder this time. Others looked uncomfortable. But what hurt the most was my son. Daniel didn't stop her. He didn't say, "That's enough." He didn't say, "Don't talk to my mother like that." He just sat there, silent, looking down at his plate. And in that moment, something inside me changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, but it was real. 40 years of sacrifice. 40 years of love. And now I understood something very clearly. To them, I was no longer family. I was just an old woman taking up space. Vanessa finished her speech with another laugh and raised her glass. "To new beginnings," she said. Everyone lifted their glasses. Everyone except me. I slowly picked up my glass of water, and as I looked around the table, I noticed something interesting. None of them knew the truth. None of them knew what I had done 2 weeks earlier. None of them knew about the papers sitting in my lawyer's office. None of them knew about the decision I had already made. Because, while they were laughing at me that night, they didn't realize something important. That dinner party was the last moment they would ever feel comfortable in this house. And the revenge I had planned was not loud, it was not violent, but it was perfect. And when the truth finally came out, the same people who laughed that night would sit in complete silence, because humiliating me was the biggest mistake my daughter-in-law would ever make. And soon, everyone at that table would understand why. Before I tell you what happened after that dinner, you need to understand something about me, because people often make the same mistake when they look at someone like me. They see an old woman, gray hair, wrinkles, slow steps, quiet voice, and they assume one thing: that she is weak, that she doesn't understand what's happening around her, that she can be pushed aside, ignored, humiliated. What they don't realize is that a person who has lived almost 70 years has seen things most people cannot imagine. My name is Margaret Collins, and my story didn't begin with humiliation. It began with love. 45 years ago, this house was filled with a very different kind of laughter. Back then, the walls were new, the paint was fresh, and the garden outside was nothing more than a patch of dirt waiting for life. My husband, Robert, and I bought this house when we were both young and hopeful. Robert worked as a mechanic in a small garage. His hands were always covered in grease. So, that's so, but his smile could light up any room. I worked as a nurse at a local hospital. We weren't rich, not even close, but we were happy, very happy. Every evening, we would sit on the small porch outside the house. Robert would drink his coffee. I would talk about my day at the hospital. And we would dream about the future. We dreamed about children running through the hallway. We dreamed about birthdays and family dinners. We dreamed about growing old together in that house. And for a while, those dreams came true. 2 years after we moved in, our son Daniel was born. I still remember the first time Robert held him. He looked at that tiny baby like he had just been given the greatest gift in the world. Margaret, he whispered to me that night in the hospital. I promise you something. What? I asked. No matter what happens, this boy will always feel loved. For years, Robert kept that promise. Daniel grew up surrounded by laughter. He played in the backyard. He ran through the hallways. He used to jump into Robert's arms every evening when he came home from work. And every night, when Daniel finally fell asleep, Robert and I would sit quietly in the living room, watching him breathe, smiling at each other. Back then, life felt simple, safe, perfect, but life has a strange way of changing everything when you least expect it. One rainy evening, everything changed. Robert was driving home from work. The road was wet. A truck driver lost control on the highway. And in a single moment, my entire world collapsed. When the police officer knocked on my door that night, I already knew. There's a certain look in someone's eyes when they bring bad news. A look that makes your heart sink before they even say a word. Robert never came home again. I was 32 years old, and suddenly I was alone. Daniel was only 8 years old and asking questions I didn't know how to answer. "Mom," he asked one night, holding his toy car, "when is Dad coming back?" I remember sitting on the floor beside him, trying to find the right words. But how do you explain death to a child? How do you explain that the person who used to carry him on his shoulders would never walk through the door again? That night, I made a promise to myself. I would never let Daniel feel the weight of my sadness. No matter how hard life became, I would protect him. And that promise shaped the rest of my life. I worked longer hours at the hospital, sometimes double shifts, sometimes night shifts. There were days when I barely slept. But every morning, I still made Daniel breakfast. Every evening, I still helped him with his homework. I attended every school event, every soccer game, every parent meeting. I wanted him to feel something very important, that he wasn't alone. Years passed. Daniel grew older. He became a tall, confident young man, smart, charming, the kind of person people naturally liked. And every time I looked at him, I saw a little bit of Robert. The same smile, the same eyes. When Daniel graduated from college, I cried for hours. Not because I was sad, but because I felt proud. So proud. All those sleepless nights, all those sacrifices, they felt worth it. Daniel hugged me tightly that day. "Mom," he said, "I couldn't have done this without you." And I believed him. For many years, Daniel and I had a close relationship. We talked often. He visited frequently. We celebrated holidays together. I truly believed we would always stay that way. But then Vanessa entered his life. At first, I tried to welcome her. She was beautiful, confident, very ambitious. Daniel introduced her to me one afternoon at a small cafe. "Mom," he said happily, "this is Vanessa." She shook my hand politely, but something about her eyes made me uneasy. It wasn't something obvious, just a small feeling, a quiet voice in the back of my mind. But I ignored it, because Daniel looked happy, and as a mother, that's all you want. When they got married, I helped pay for the wedding. It wasn't cheap, but I wanted their day to be special. Vanessa smiled in every photograph, but as time passed, I started noticing things, small comments, little remarks that seemed harmless at first. She often talked about money, about success, about appearances. Sometimes she joked about people who lived simple lives, people like me. Daniel always laughed along with her. I told myself it was nothing, just personality differences. But the distance between us slowly began to grow. Then one day, Daniel came to visit me. He sat down at the kitchen table with a serious expression. "Mom," he said gently, "Vanessa and I were thinking." And those words changed everything, because that was the moment he suggested something that would eventually lead to the humiliation I experienced that night. He said, moving in together would be better for everyone. So again, he said the house was too big for me. He said I needed family around. And like the mother who had spent her entire life trusting her son, I agreed. I didn't know then. That decision would slowly turn my own home into a place where I felt like a stranger. But the worst moment was still waiting for me, because the humiliation at that dinner table was only the beginning, and what Vanessa did next would push me to make a decision that changed all of our lives forever. When Daniel and Vanessa moved into my house, I truly believed it was the beginning of a new chapter for our family. For years, the house had been quiet, too quiet. After Daniel moved out and started his own life, the rooms felt larger, emptier. Sometimes I would walk through the hallway at night and pause in front of his old bedroom. The door was always slightly open. Inside, the furniture was still the same. The bookshelf he used as a child. The old desk where he used to do his homework. Even some of his childhood trophies still stood on the shelf, covered in a thin layer of dust. Sometimes I would stand there for a few minutes, remembering the sound of his laughter when he was young, remembering the days when the house felt alive. So when Daniel told me he wanted to move back home with Vanessa, part of me felt happy. I thought maybe the house would feel warm again, full of life, full of voices, full of family. And for the first few weeks, that's exactly how it seemed. The day they moved in, the house was full of energy. Boxes everywhere. Vanessa directing movers like a manager. Daniel carrying furniture up the stairs. I even cooked a big dinner that evening to celebrate. We sat together in the dining room, just the three of us. And for a moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Vanessa smiled politely. Daniel laughed at my old stories. The house felt alive again, but slowly, very slowly. Something began to change. At first, it was small things, little things that seemed harmless. One afternoon, I came home from grocery shopping and noticed that the living room looked different. The couch had been moved. The pictures on the wall were gone. Pictures of Robert and me. Pictures of Daniel as a child. In their place were modern paintings and decorations I didn't recognize. When I asked Vanessa about it, she smiled casually. "Oh, I just thought the house needed a fresher look," she said. It felt a little old. The word stayed in my mind longer than it should have, but I didn't say anything. After all, she lived there now too. Maybe she just wanted to make the house feel more like home. A few weeks later, the changes continued. Vanessa started reorganizing the kitchen. She moved dishes, changed the cabinets, rearranged everything. One morning, I opened a drawer looking for a spoon and realized nothing was where it used to be. Vanessa moved things around, Daniel said when I asked him. She's just trying to make the space more efficient. Again, I nodded and stayed quiet. But inside, and I started feeling something strange, like a guest in my own home. Then the parties began. Vanessa loved hosting gatherings, dinner parties, wine nights, weekend celebrations. Every few days, new people came to the house. Friends from her job, business, partners, people I had never met before. They laughed loudly. They talked about expensive vacations, luxury cars, investments. Sometimes I would sit quietly in the corner of the living room while they talked, listening, watching, feeling like I didn't belong in their world. One evening, I overheard Vanessa talking to one of her friends. They were standing near the staircase, holding glasses of wine. Her friend looked around the house and said, "This place is beautiful. You're lucky." Vanessa laughed. "Oh, it will look even better once we renovate everything," she said. "Right now, it still has that old-fashioned feel." Her friend asked, "Is it your house?" Vanessa hesitated for just a moment. Then she smiled. "It will be." I felt a chill run down my spine when I heard those words. It will be. Not maybe. Not someday. But as if it were already decided. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying those words in my mind. For the first time, a small doubt began to grow in my heart. Did Daniel and Vanessa move in because they wanted to be close to me, or because they wanted something else? But every time those thoughts appeared, I pushed them away, because the idea that my own son could betray me was too painful to accept. So I kept living my routine. Every morning I woke up early, made coffee, watered the plants in the garden. Sometimes I walked through the neighborhood park. Many of the neighbors had known me for decades. They would wave and ask about Daniel. "Must be nice having family back in the house," one of them said one morning. I smiled and nodded. "Yes," I said softly. "It is." But inside, I wasn't so sure anymore, because something else had started happening. Something small, but very telling. Vanessa began introducing me differently to people. At first, she said, "This is Margaret, Daniel's mom." But slowly, that changed. One evening during a dinner party, she introduced me to a guest and said something that made my heart sink. "This is Margaret," she said casually. "She used to own the house." Used to. The word felt like a quiet slap. I stood there frozen for a moment. Used to own? The house was still legally mine. Nothing had changed, but in Vanessa's mind. The decision had already been made. And the worst part? Daniel didn't correct her. He just smiled awkwardly and changed the subject. That night, I realized something important. The house I had spent 40 years protecting was slowly being taken away from me. Not with force, not with arguments, but with something much more subtle. Control, piece by piece. Room by room, moment by moment. Until one day, I might wake up and realize that I had completely disappeared from my own life. But what Vanessa didn't know was that I was paying attention very carefully, and the humiliation she caused at that dinner party later would be the final push that forced me to take action, because sometimes the quietest people are the ones who see everything. And when they finally decide to act, no one sees it coming. After Daniel and Vanessa had been living in the house for a few months, the atmosphere slowly began to change. At first, it was so subtle that I almost convinced myself it was just my imagination. But over time, the changes became impossible to ignore. One morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The sun was just beginning to rise, and the house was still quiet. I walked into the kitchen to make my morning coffee, just like I had done for the past 40 years. But when I opened the cabinet to grab my favorite mug, it wasn't there. I checked another cabinet, then another. Finally, I found it in a box on the bottom shelf. Inside that same box were several other things that belonged to me. My old teapot, the wooden spoon my husband used to cook with, even the small plate Daniel used when he was a child. Everything had been packed away. Confused, I closed the cabinet and stood there for a moment. Then Vanessa walked into the kitchen. She looked surprised to see me. "Oh, you're awake already?" she said. I held up the mug from the box. "Why were these packed away?" I asked gently. Vanessa smiled like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Oh, I reorganized the kitchen last night," she said casually. "These older things don't really match the new style." I looked around the kitchen. New dishes, new glasses, new decorations, everything modern, everything shiny, everything unfamiliar. I slowly placed the mug on the counter. "But this is my house," I said quietly. Vanessa shrugged slightly. "Well, Daniel and I live here now too," she replied. Her tone wasn't aggressive, but the message was clear. Things were changing, and my opinions were no longer important. Over the next few weeks, the situation slowly became worse. Vanessa began making decisions about the house without even mentioning them to me. One afternoon, I came home from the grocery store and found 2 workers measuring the living room walls. When I asked what they were doing, one of them replied, "We're preparing for the renovation." Renovation? I hadn't heard anything about a renovation. When I asked Vanessa later, she explained it like it was no big deal. "We're planning to remodel the living room and the kitchen," she said excitedly. "It will increase the value of the property." The property, not the home. The property. That night, I tried to talk to Daniel privately. We sat together in the backyard, the same backyard where he used to play as a child. "Daniel," I said softly, "I wish you would discuss these things with me first." "Ayant commence." He sighed and rubbed his forehead. "Mom, Vanessa just wants to improve the house," he said. "It's not a big deal." "But it is a big deal," I replied. "This house means something to me." Daniel looked uncomfortable. "Mom, you worry too much," he said. "You should just relax and enjoy life. Enjoy life." It sounded simple, but how could I relax in a place that no longer felt like mine? Still, I didn't want to create conflict, so I stayed quiet. But Vanessa didn't stop. In fact, she became even more confident. Soon, she started treating the house like it belonged completely to her. Her friends visited constantly. Her voice filled the rooms. Her decisions controlled everything. One afternoon, something happened that made my heart sink even deeper. I was sitting in the living room reading when Vanessa walked in with two women. They were looking around the house carefully. One of them held a notebook. The other had a measuring tape. "What's going on?" I asked. Vanessa smiled brightly. "Oh, these are interior designers," she explained. "They're helping us redesign the house." One of the women looked at me politely and asked, "Are you the previous owner?" "Previous owner." The words hit me like cold water. I opened my mouth to correct her, but Vanessa answered first. "Yes," she said smoothly. "Margaret lived here for many years before we moved in." I felt my chest tighten. That wasn't true. I still lived there. The house was still legally mine, but in that moment, Vanessa had quietly erased me. And the worst part, Daniel was standing right behind her, listening, watching, and saying nothing. Later, that night, I went to my room and sat quietly on the edge of the bed. I stared at the photo of Robert on my nightstand, the same photo that had been there for decades. "Robert," I whispered softly. "I don't recognize our home anymore." For the first time in many years, I felt truly alone. But what happened next was even worse. Because Vanessa didn't just want control of the house. She wanted control of something else too. My dignity. And the night she humiliated me in front of everyone was the moment everything changed. Because that night, I stopped being silent, and I started making a plan. A plan that would teach my daughter-in-law something she had clearly forgotten. Never underestimate the quiet strength of a mother who has nothing left to lose. After that day, with the interior designers, something inside me quietly changed. For months, I had tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that Vanessa's behavior was just a misunderstanding, that Daniel would eventually realize what was happening. But deep down, I was starting to understand something painful. They weren't treating me like the owner of the house. They weren't even treating me like family anymore. To them, I had slowly become nothing more than an inconvenience. A quiet shadow moving through the halls of a house that used to be mine. And the worst part was, the more comfortable Vanessa became, the less she tried to hide it. Her tone changed. Her attitude changed. The way she spoke to me changed. One evening, I was sitting in the living room watching television when Vanessa walked in holding her phone. She looked irritated. "Margaret," she said sharply. I looked up. "Yes?" "You left the kitchen, light on earlier today." I blinked in confusion. "Oh, go." "I must have forgotten to turn it off," I said. Vanessa crossed her arms. "Well, electricity costs money, she replied coldly. For a moment, I just stared at her. Electricity costs money. I had paid the bills in this house for 40 years. 40 years. But somehow, I had become the person being lectured about expenses. I'll be more careful, I said quietly. Vanessa nodded like she had just disciplined a child. Then she walked away. I sat there in silence for a long time, trying to understand how things had reached this point. But unfortunately, that moment was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Vanessa began setting new rules around the house. Rules that I had never agreed to. Rules that made me feel like a guest in my own home. One morning, she placed a printed list on the refrigerator. That's list titled House Guidelines. I stood there reading it slowly, quiet hours after 9 p.m. Kitchen must be cleaned immediately after use. Personal guests must be approved first. No moving furniture without permission. I felt my hands tremble slightly. Permission? Who exactly was supposed to give permission in my own house? Later that evening, I asked Daniel about it. We were sitting at the dining table. Did you see the list Vanessa put on the refrigerator? I asked. Daniel looked uncomfortable. Yeah, she just wants things organized, he said. But Daniel, I said gently, this is my home. He sighed. Mom, please don't make this difficult. Don't make this difficult. Those words stayed in my mind for hours because suddenly I realized something. In Daniel's eyes, the problem wasn't Vanessa's behavior. The problem was me, my presence, my feelings, my existence. And then the dinner parties started becoming worse. Vanessa began inviting more people than ever before. Every weekend, the house filled with strangers. Loud music, loud laughter, expensive conversations about business and money. But I noticed something else, too. Vanessa started making small jokes about me in front of her guests. At first, they sounded harmless. Little comments disguised as humor. One evening, a guest asked about the age of the house. Vanessa laughed and said, "Well, Margaret has been here since the dinosaurs." Everyone laughed. I forced a smile. Another night, someone complimented the garden. Vanessa replied, "Margaret spends most of her time there. It keeps her busy, so she doesn't complain too much." Again, laughter. Each time it happened, the same feeling returned. A mixture of embarrassment and sadness. But I stayed quiet. I didn't want to create a scene. I didn't want Daniel to feel uncomfortable. So I kept pretending everything was fine. Until one particular evening, an evening I will never forget. Vanessa had organized one of her biggest dinner parties yet. Nearly 15 guests filled the house. The dining table was extended. Candles lit the room. Music played softly in the background. Everyone seemed excited. Vanessa was walking around proudly, introducing people to each other. Daniel was pouring drinks, and I was sitting quietly at the end of the table, just watching, trying to stay invisible. At one point, I overheard two women whispering near the kitchen. "Who is that older woman?" one of them asked. Vanessa answered with a small laugh. "Oh, she's Daniel's mom." The woman looked surprised. She lives here? Vanessa shrugged. For now. For now. Those two simple words felt heavier than anything she had said before. But the real humiliation was still coming. Because later that evening, Vanessa decided to do something that would push me past my limit. Something cruel. Something unnecessary. Something that would finally make me realize I could no longer stay silent. Because sometimes people only respect you after you remind them who you truly are. And that night, Vanessa was about to learn that lesson the hard way. That dinner party should have been like all the others. Loud laughter, expensive conversations, people pretending to be impressed with each other. But something about that night felt different from the beginning. Maybe it was the way Vanessa kept looking at me across the table. Maybe it was the way Daniel avoided meeting my eyes. Or maybe it was the quiet feeling in my chest, telling me something important was about to happen. The dining room was full. Nearly 15 people sat around the long table. Candles flickered softly, reflecting off the wine glasses. Vanessa stood at the center of it all, smiling confidently as she entertained her guests. She loved being the center of attention, and tonight was no different. I sat quietly at the far end of the table, trying to stay unnoticed. But, unfortunately, Vanessa had other plans. Dinner had just finished when she suddenly stood up from her chair. She picked up her wine glass and tapped it gently with a spoon. Clink, clink, clink. The sound echoed through the room. Everyone turned toward her. Attention, everyone, she said cheerfully. People smiled and leaned forward. They were expecting another one of Vanessa's charming little speeches. I felt a strange knot form in my stomach, because the way she was smiling didn't feel kind. Vanessa looked around the table dramatically before continuing. I just want to say how happy I am that everyone could come tonight, she said. A few people clapped politely. Then her eyes slowly moved across the table until they stopped on me. And I'd also like to thank someone very special, she added. I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. Margaret, she said loudly. All the guests turned to look at me. Some smiled politely. Others looked curious, forced a small smile, and nodded. But Vanessa's next words felt like ice. I want to thank Margaret for teaching us all an important lesson. The room grew quiet. What lesson? Someone asked jokingly. Vanessa laughed softly. She raised her glass slightly. The lesson of what happens when someone refuses to move on with their life. A few awkward laughs filled the room. My hands tightened in my lap. Vanessa continued speaking. You see, Margaret still thinks this house belongs to her. Several guests exchanged confused looks. Vanessa shook her head playfully. But the truth is, Daniel and I are the ones building the future here. Someone laughed loudly this time. Vanessa leaned slightly toward the table. Sometimes people hold on to the past so tightly, they forget when it's time to step aside. More laughter. My face burned. I could feel every pair of eyes in the room looking at me. Some guests looked uncomfortable. Others seemed entertained. But the one person I hoped would say something said nothing. Daniel. He sat quietly beside Vanessa, looking down at his plate, not defending me, not even looking at me. And, in that moment, something inside me finally broke, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, like a door closing forever. Vanessa raised her glass again. "So tonight," she said, smiling proudly, "let's toast to new beginnings." Everyone lifted their glasses, except me. I slowly picked up my glass of water, and for the first time that evening, I spoke. My voice was calm, quiet, but clear. "Vanessa," I said. The room immediately became silent. She looked at me, slightly surprised. "Yes, Margaret?" I stood up slowly from my chair. My hands rested gently on the table, and then I said something that no one in that room expected. "You're absolutely right." Vanessa blinked in confusion. "I am?" she asked. "Yes," I replied calmly. "You're right about one thing." The guests looked at each other curiously. "What's that?" Vanessa asked. I looked around the room, at every face watching me. Then I spoke again. "It is time for new beginnings." For a moment, no one understood what I meant. Vanessa laughed awkwardly. "Well, Chata, sire, I'm glad you finally agree," she said, but I simply nodded. "Oh, I do," I replied. Then I picked up my napkin and placed it neatly beside my plate. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," I said politely, and with that, I quietly walked out of the dining room. Behind me, I could hear whispers, confused voices. Vanessa trying to laugh it off, but none of them knew something very important. 2 weeks earlier, I had already visited my lawyer. 2 weeks earlier, I had already made a decision about this house, and by the time the truth came out, the same people who laughed at me that night would sit in stunned silence, because the revenge I had planned was already in motion, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. When I walked out of the dining room that night, the house felt strangely quiet. Behind me, I could still hear the faint sound of voices. Vanessa trying to laugh, guests whispering to each other, chairs moving. But I didn't stop walking. I slowly went upstairs and closed the door to my bedroom. For a long moment, I simply stood there in the silence. My heart was beating slowly, but steadily, not with anger, not even with sadness anymore, but with something else, clarity. Because the humiliation that night had finally removed the last bit of doubt from my mind. For months, I had been hoping things would change, hoping Daniel would notice what was happening, hoping Vanessa would show some kindness. But that dinner table had shown me the truth. To them, I was no longer important. And once you accept the truth, you can finally act. I walked to the small desk near the window and opened the drawer. Inside was a simple brown folder, the same folder I had placed there 2 weeks earlier. Inside were copies of several documents, important documents, legal documents. And at the very top of the stack was the business card of my lawyer. a kind, patient man named Mr. Carter. 2 weeks earlier, I had visited his office for the first time in nearly 20 years. At the time, I still wasn't completely sure what I wanted to do, but something inside me had been warning me. Something had been telling me that I needed to protect myself, and that quiet voice had been right. I sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at the folder. Then my mind drifted back to that day at the lawyer's office. The waiting room had been quiet. Soft music playing. The smell of fresh coffee in the air. Mr. Carter greeted me with a warm smile when I walked in. "Margaret," he said kindly, shaking my hand. "It's been a long time." "Yes," I replied softly. "Too long." We sat down in his office. For a moment, I didn't know where to begin, but eventually, the words started coming out. I told him everything, about Daniel moving in, about Vanessa's behavior, about the renovations, about how I slowly began feeling like a stranger in my own home. Mr. Carter listened carefully. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. When I finally finished speaking, he leaned back in his chair and asked a simple question. "Margaret, what do you want to happen?" The question surprised me, because for months, I had been so focused on surviving the situation that I had never truly asked myself that question. What did I want? Did I want revenge? Did I want Daniel to suffer? Did I want to fight? I sat quietly for a moment. Then I shook my head. "No," I said slowly. "I don't want revenge." Mr. Carter nodded thoughtfully. "Then what do you want?" I looked down at my hands. "I want peace," I said softly. "I want respect. And most of all, I want my life back." Mr. Carter remained silent for a moment. Then he opened a file on his desk. "Margaret," he said carefully, "legally speaking, the house still belongs entirely to you." "I know," I replied, "but that doesn't seem to matter to them." Mr. Carter gave a small smile. "Sometimes," he said, "the truth matters more than people realize." Then he explained something that changed everything, something Vanessa and Daniel had never even considered. "You have several options," he said. "You could sell the house, you could transfer ownership, or you could place it into a trust with specific conditions." I looked at him curiously. "What kind of conditions?" Mr. Carter folded his hands together. "For example, you could ensure that the house is used for a purpose that reflects your values. A purpose that cannot be controlled by Daniel or Vanessa." I felt a small spark of interest. "What kind of purpose?" Mr. Carter smiled gently. "Something meaningful," he said. "A charity, a community center, a shelter, a place that helps people." For the first time during that entire conversation, I smiled, because suddenly, an idea began forming in my mind. An idea that felt right, not cruel, not hateful, but fair. The house had been built with love. It had been protected through sacrifice. It deserved to belong to something better than greed. I looked at Mr. Carter and said quietly, "I know exactly what I want to do." And that afternoon, we began preparing the documents. Back in my bedroom that night, I opened the folder again. My fingers gently touched the papers inside. Everything was already signed, already finalized, already official. Daniel and Vanessa just didn't know it yet. Downstairs, I could hear the dinner party slowly coming to an end. Guests saying goodbye. Doors opening. Cars starting outside. Soon the moment would come when the truth would finally be revealed. And when it did, the same people who laughed at me earlier that night would realize something they never expected. They had never been planning my future because I had already decided it myself. And the decision I made was say it all. Everything. By the time the last guest left the house that night, it was already late. The laughter and noise that had filled the dining room only hours earlier had slowly faded into silence. The house felt calm again, almost peaceful. But downstairs, the atmosphere was very different. I could hear Vanessa moving around in the kitchen, cabinets opening, dishes clattering. Her footsteps sounded sharp and impatient. She was clearly annoyed. A few minutes later, I heard Daniel's voice. "Vanessa, relax," he said quietly. "I'm relaxed," she replied, though her voice said otherwise. "You didn't have to embarrass her like that," Daniel added. Vanessa scoffed. "Oh, please," she said. She needed to hear the truth eventually. There was a short silence. Then Daniel spoke again. "You know, she didn't say much tonight." Vanessa laughed. "Exactly," she replied, "because she knows I'm right." Upstairs in my room, I listened quietly, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with calm certainty, because the moment they were about to face was already written. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Daniel knocked gently on my bedroom door. "Mom?" he called softly. I opened the door. He looked uncomfortable. Behind him, Vanessa stood with her arms crossed. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, about tonight," he said. I smiled gently. "There's no need to apologize," I replied calmly. Daniel looked surprised. "Really?" "Yes," I said. "Actually, I've been thinking a lot lately." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "Oh," she said. I stepped aside and gestured for them to come into the room. They both walked in. Vanessa glanced around the bedroom impatiently. "So, what did you want to talk about?" she asked. I walked to my desk and picked up the brown folder. "The house," I said quietly. Immediately, Vanessa's attention sharpened. "What about it?" she asked. I opened the folder slowly and removed a set of papers. Daniel looked confused. "Mom, what is that?" I handed him the documents. "Those are legal papers," I explained. Daniel began reading them. At first, his expression showed simple curiosity, but then it slowly changed. Confusion, then shock, then disbelief. "What is this?" he asked quietly. Vanessa grabbed the papers from his hands. Her eyes moved quickly across the page. For a few seconds, the room was completely silent. Then she looked up at me. "You transferred the house?" she asked sharply. I nodded calmly. "Yes." Vanessa's face turned pale. "To who?" Daniel asked nervously. I folded my hands together. "To a charitable foundation." They both stared at me. "A foundation?" Vanessa repeated. "Yes," I said. "The house now belongs to a non-profit organization that helps single mothers and their children." The silence that followed was heavy. Vanessa's mouth opened slightly. "You're joking," she said. "I'm not." Daniel looked down at the papers again. "But, Mom, this means—" "Yes," I replied gently. "It means the house will be converted into a support center." Vanessa's voice suddenly rose. "You can't do that." "I already did," I said calmly. "It's legally finalized." Daniel looked completely stunned. "But where will we live?" he asked. I looked at him quietly. "That's something you'll need to figure out." Vanessa's anger exploded. "This is insane," she shouted. "We've been living here for months." "You've been living here as guests," I corrected calmly. Her face turned red. "You did this just to punish us," she accused. I shook my head slowly. "No," I replied. "I did this to protect something important." "What?" Vanessa demanded. I looked around the room at the walls that held 40 years of memories. Then I answered softly, "This house was built with love. It survived loss. It survived struggle. And it deserves to help people who truly need it." Daniel's voice became quiet. "So, we're being kicked out?" I sighed gently. "You have 30 days," I said. "The foundation will begin renovations after that." Vanessa stared at me with disbelief. "You just gave away a house worth hundreds of thousands of dollars." "Yes," I said calmly, "and for the first time in a long time, it finally feels like the right decision." Daniel sank slowly into the chair beside the desk. His face looked pale. Vanessa, however, was furious. "You'll regret this," she said bitterly. But I simply smiled softly. "No," I replied. "For the first time in months, I feel free," because the truth was simple. The revenge I had planned was never about hurting them. It was about reminding them of something they had forgotten: respect. And sometimes, the most powerful revenge isn't cruelty. It's walking away with dignity and building something better from the ruins others tried to create. After that night, the house felt different, quiet, peaceful, alive in a way it hadn't been for months. Not because of parties or loud laughter, but because it had a purpose again. I spent the next few days walking through the rooms I had lived in for 40 years. Every corner, every wall, every faded photograph whispered memories. Memories of love, struggle, and sacrifice. Memories that no one, not Vanessa, not Daniel, not anyone, could ever take away from me. As I walked, I reflected on everything that had happened: the humiliation, the betrayal, the sense of being invisible in my own home. It hurt. It hurt deeply, but it also taught me something important. People will test you. They will try to push you aside. They will disrespect the things you love, thinking you are too weak to fight back. But strength isn't always loud. Sometimes strength is quiet, patient, calculated, and most importantly, strength is about knowing your worth. I realized that revenge isn't about hurting others. It's about reclaiming yourself. It's about protecting what you love. It's about teaching lessons without stooping to cruelty. Vanessa and Daniel had thought the house gave them power, but the house was never theirs to control. It belonged to memories, to love, to life lessons, and by giving it to something meaningful, helping single mothers and children, I turned their arrogance into my own empowerment. I understood something else too. Humiliation and betrayal can feel like the end of the world. They can make you question your worth. They can make you doubt everything you've done. But these moments are not the end. They are a beginning, a chance to rise above, a chance to do what's right, not for revenge, but for yourself. Because at the end of the day, dignity, courage, and love are more powerful than any insult or betrayal. And when you stand tall and make decisions with integrity, even those who humiliated, you will realize, sometimes too late, that you were never the weak one. Walking through that house, I smiled softly. I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel hurt anymore. I felt free. And I understood, finally, that this was the true lesson of my story. Life will test you. People will betray you, and circumstances will try to break you. But the power to define your life, to protect your dignity, and to turn pain into purpose, that power has always been yours. And once you claim it, nothing can take it away.